Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here and welcome to Viewer Questions, which, as the name implies, is a place for me to answer questions sent in by you, the viewers. So if you'd like to have your question potentially answered in the future, just throw it in the comments down below. Now I do want to say that I was tempted to take a look at the question that was most upvoted or liked or whatever you're supposed to call it in the comments of the last video, but that talked about the Sino changes in particular. And as we've seen recently with the introduction of the freight Sino and a few other things, those Sino changes really aren't as set in stone as people seem to think they are. So I'm going to double back and answer that question when it actually will start to play out in game and we have a feel for how things are really going to work. Anyway, the question that we will be answering is from LOOL, who writes, "Great video. Do you think that signature tank kind of gameplay is in a good state? What would you change?" And I thought that this is kind of a question that's very interesting to tackle, just because there are three layers of ways people tend to look at sig tanking, and because of that, sig tanking is a really complicated thing to just talk about, because you could mean it in the kind of loosest sense, which is just using signature and speed to avoid or mitigate damage. And there are two fleets right now that are big parts of the meta, and they take advantage of that in pretty much every fight they take a part of, and that's Munins and Eagles. Munins use their high speed and the fact that they can use the MWD plus the hack bonus to have a relatively low signature to make it hard for other doctrines like to some extent Ferox's, any kind of battleship doctrine really, to track them. So they are sig tanking if you want to use that kind of interpretation. And then even more specifically, you've got Eagles, which are using ABs typically, and whilst they are primarily trying to use range from what I understand as their main advantage versus the Munin, there's also definitely a part of that which is just, if you're ABing around an MWD Munin, there's a good chance that you're going to take less damage because you can get transversal on them. And I don't think there's a lot of people who are going to try and argue that the Munin or the Eagle aren't a very powerful ship in the current meta. It's just not that sig tanking is their focus as a doctrine. So let's dive a little deeper and try and look for, an undersized ship that uses an AB as its primary way to avoid damage, and I guess with the aim of punching up to bigger holes. That's probably a more specific definition that you'd use to define sig tanking, and we still see doctrines that really do fit into that basket that are quite powerful in the meta. I mean, Stukas are a really good example of a sig tanking doctrine. It's just that they combine that with a lot of mobility from command destroyers and a lot of AoE, just general DPS from bombs and Kikimoras and a lot of other tools. But make no mistake, when they are getting into the mix with Lokis and rattlesnakes, like we've seen Pando do multiple times, they're absolutely not using just the fact that they're bombers and they can dip in and out of the fight as their main tank. They are staying in there and using that signature tank and some frigate logistics to stay alive, and that's the very definition of sig tanking really. And Stukas are probably one of the better roaming fleets in the meta right now, or more accurately skirmish fleets. They're one of the few things that can set up on a supposed objective like say a rock wall and then force a sub-capital response instead of just a capital one, and that's what gives them their very defining role in the current meta. It's that you do need to bring something a little more specialised to actively deal with them, and that makes them different to the vast majority of doctrines. And Stukas aren't the only doctrine that is viable right now which relies on signature tanking as its primary means of defence, because we also have the 100 MN healer. And this is a doctrine that's a bit of an outlier because it doesn't scale up particularly well, but in the 30 to 60, maybe even edging into the 100 man kind of range, healers, especially 100 man healers, are really powerful. They just benefit a ton from the fact that they're hard to lock down, so you're never going to lose your entire fleet. They can kill tackle really well, they do a lot of damage especially to cruisers, so you can volley logistics. The problem is that as you get bigger and bigger, you become more susceptible to smart bombs, the drone time lag starts to impact the fight more. Sorry about the plane, by the way, but I'm not re-recording that. But despite those two examples, I want to go a little deeper and look at the third possible thing that people sometimes use when they're talking about signature tanking, because it is entirely possible that this is what LOOL was talking about in the first place, and that's the kind of, armor cruiser, close range, AHAC style doctrine. And those don't quite have the same place in the meta, but there is still kind of a doctrine which fits that role, and that's the Legion fleet that we see some particular low-sec entities like Siege Green and Snuffed Out use. And they generally serve as a counter to battleship-heavy opponents that are locked down by being in triage, like I've typically seen them be used in Providence versus their fax-based Macario doctrines, and I've seen them be used in the North versus the fax-based Rattlesnake doctrines that Darkness use, and in that role they do serve really well, actually. Now, I do have to say that I'm a little more skeptical of the idea of a Legion fleet being really top tier, but, there's every chance that I'm wrong there. I'm just always terrified about getting void bombed or in some way super duper cap warfared out, especially when I'm using a ship like the Legion, which has a very low amount of mid slots to begin with. But if it works, it works. I can't deny it seems to have gotten a lot of results. The only problem there is that these ships do tend to cost somewhere in the region of $1 billion-isk each, so they aren't really the same level of accessible for larger nullsec groups, which is probably one of the reasons why you haven't seen them be picked up, along with a couple of other things which we're going to talk about in a moment. But outside of the Legion, there is a little bit of a problem in that armor cruisers just aren't very viable, or at least they aren't viable in the same way that they have been in the past. So currently a lot of the meta is focused on mobility, and you can see that in the doctrine choices. Obviously things like the Munin and the Eagle are focused on being relatively quick, relatively able to disengage from a fight, and overall relatively small ships, and that's because you don't want to stay on a grid where you're going to be continually losing a fight. You don't want to get caught down, and that's also because there's no real reason for a defender or someone who's a smaller party, could be the attacker, could be the defender, to really commit battleships or other heavy assets and then try and back those up with capitals and super capitals. Simply because if their opponent's able to out-escalate them, it's gonna end worse than if they tried to use a skirmish fleet and it went, mediocre to poorly for them in that kind of an engagement, which is a lot of what we're seeing in the Legacy Winter War right now. So in magical fairy Christmas land where the sun is shining, the cherry blooms are blossoming, and typhoons actually work in a fleet context, you theoretically might be able to use an AHAC doctrine or an AHAC style doctrine to scram down all the members of a Munin fleet and then use that to get on top of them, but in practice that just doesn't work. To really make a Zealot or any type of AHAC fleet work, you need to have a wealth of targets that are going to be slow enough that your afterburner ship will be able to, at the very least, stay relevant with them in speed, even if you aren't going to be faster than them. And compare the speed of an AV Zealot, which is something like 600, 700 meters a second, to the speed of a Munin, which is 2,000 plus, and it becomes obvious just how difficult it's going to be for you to keep anyone in that range where you have an advantage with a close range sig tanking fleet. And once you get a lot of distance between yourself and a sig tanking fleet, sig tanking becomes less effective, which is something you can go and listen to me ramble about in my How Do Turrets Work video, which I will link up here, maybe, hopefully, we'll see. Anyway, so the final part of that question was just asking if I thought any changes were needed, and generally I don't. I feel like the problem with sig tanking doctrines is just that there aren't enough things that sig tanking doctrines prey on that are viable in the meta right now to make the things that prey on them viable in the first place. But, let's think of some hypothetical scenario in an alternate universe where CCP busts down my door and they demand to know what they can do to buff the Zealot so that Shadow will start playing again or something. And if that was the case, I'd probably say that the main thing that AHACs or AHAC-style doctrines need is a way to keep their opponents in an area for long enough for them to set up other range control elements. Because right now, whilst you're landing from warp, your opponents have like 5 to 10 to like half a minute's warning if you're in tie-dye before you're even going to land on them. So they have time to put their MWDs on and burn out in a specific direction, and you're just not going to catch most of their fleet, even with like heated, boosted scrams. So I feel like what you probably need is a way to stop that from happening, and a way to lock them down for just long enough for a AHAC fleet to get on top of them. So something like a battleship with an AoE scram, or a battlecruiser with an AoE scram that will last for like 2 to 3 seconds, or a bomb, or anything of that description would probably be the best way to do it. Or maybe like a 30 to 40 kilometer MJD could work, but that's, adding more MJD fields is a scary prospect from my kind of personal point of view, because you don't want to end up in that like League of Legends style meta where everything is mobility. I think for EVE that would be especially bad, just because the navigation mechanics in EVE are supposed to be quite relative, so they don't work very well when you're just zipping around in random directions. It gets very hard to understand what's happening on the battlefield. But yeah, the main thing that I think they need is a way to force an engagement at the range that they want to have an engagement, basically. Which is the same thing most doctrines need, really. Alright, well that about wraps up my thoughts on SIG tanking, so thank you very much for watching. A special shout out, as always, goes out to Pinche Infidel, our Crassus from Old School, as well as our $5 patrons in Dustin Prater, Meeks, and Czar. If you want to help support the content, you can do so at patreon.com/Jin'taan, or by subscribing and liking the videos. Have a great day, and until next time, fly smart.